So, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. If you've attended one of these sessions in the past, you'll know that it's been a bit of a minute since our last one, and we're really glad to be back today. We are doing things a little bit differently. We're not using a PowerPoint, no slide deck. It's a good old-fashioned conversation about workplace accommodations. So I'm just going to dive in. We are recording this session, so I'll send that around at the end of day today or tomorrow. And any questions that you might have, we're going to save to the end if we have time, but hopefully we're going to cover a lot of those throughout the session today. So as many of you know, that accommodations can be complex, messy, and sometimes really hard to navigate, but they're also really essential for building equitable, inclusive, and high-performing workplaces. So really today is just all about unpacking that in a really candid, practical way. So before we dive in, though, I want to introduce our two guests today. And thank you both for joining us. So we do have Melissa Roth here. Melissa is a partner at Gowling WLG in Waterloo, where she practices exclusively in employment, labor, and human rights law. She advises clients both in public and private sector, and she regularly appears before tribunals, arbitrators, and courts. So Melissa has been recognized as one of the best lawyers in Canada since 2023. That's a well-earned recognition for her strategic, practical, and solutions-based approach. On a personal note, I've known Melissa probably for about 8 or 9 years now. We've worked together for quite a long time. And I can tell you that she's smart, she's deeply practical, and she is a heck of a lot of fun to work with. And I genuinely enjoy that. Doesn't matter what my question is, she never makes me feel silly for asking it. So she's wonderful. We also have Michelle Bilodeau, who's joining us today to moderate the session. So Michelle brings about 20 years of HR and people leadership experience. She currently leads a team, the People in Culture strategy at a fully remote Canadian nonprofit. And like many of you here today, she's seen her fair share of wild and wonderful things in the workplace. So I've known Michelle for probably about 15 years now. Our children went to the same school, same primary school, and we've actually met at a few school events and stayed in touch ever since. So I've always admired her insight, her warmth, and her real world savvy. And you'll get all that from today's session, just hearing her talk. And I'm Erin. Most of you know who I am. So I'm the senior consultant with Oxford HR Group. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Michelle, to dive into our conversation today.
Thanks so much, Erin. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here today and honored to be in such excellent company. And as Erin said, I, like you, have encountered a lot of wild and weird stuff in the workplace. So suffice it to say that as HR pros and people leaders, we do often find ourselves facing common challenges and asking the same questions, real head scratchers. How do we balance legal obligations with compassion? How do we support our teams while protecting the integrity of our operations? And when it comes to accommodation, how do we get it right when the path forward is rarely clear? Workplace accommodations touch on so many aspects of our roles, as you well know, compliance, communication, equity, and culture. And yet, despite the policies and frameworks that we may have in place, we know from experience that no two situations are exactly alike. The nuance, the timing, the personalities involved, all of that plays a big part. So I'm honored again to be here. I'll be guiding us through today's discussion with Melissa and Erin, two people who bring deep expertise and a lot of lived experience to the topic. So let's get rolling. First question, we'll start with some basic foundational items to kick the session off. What are workplace accommodations and why are they important? So over to Melissa.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you, Erin, for the wonderful introduction. These two ladies are great people to work with as well. It's great to be here today. Thank you, all of you, for attending, and I will get started so that we can get through all of the questions and hopefully your questions too. So, Michelle, workplace accommodations are adjustments or modifications that are made to the work environment or to job duties or to work processes to enable employees with disabilities or other human rights protected grounds, characteristics, to perform their job effectively and with dignity, to be a valuable contributor to the workplace, but always ensuring that the performance of that job includes performing the essential duties of their position. So these accommodations can include things like modified work hours or assistive technologies or ergonomic equipment, flexible scheduling, changes to the job duties that do not affect the essential duties, or just other types of modifications to the workplace. I think the answer wouldn't be complete if we don't cover the fact that accommodations are important for several reasons. Number one, it's a legal obligation. Employers have a legal duty to accommodate to the point short of undue hardship, and this is under every legislation in different provinces, as well as for those of you who are federally regulated. Equity and inclusion. Accommodations promote equal opportunity by removing barriers that prevent individuals from fully participating in the workplace, and they help ensure that all employees can contribute meaningfully, regardless of their individual circumstances. If those two are not enough, it is ultimately the right thing to do. Respect for dignity. The accommodation process respects the dignity, privacy, and autonomy of the individual. It is definitely not a one-size-fits-all approach. As Michelle mentioned, each situation is unique. Each accommodation has to be tailored to the individual specific needs of the employee, as well as the workplace. But if none of this matters to the employer, then the next one does, which is organizational benefits. Beyond compliance with legislation and doing the right thing, inclusive workplaces benefit from higher employee engagement, reduced turnover, and a much broader talent pool. Accommodations can foster a culture of respect, flexibility, and innovation. This, in turn, translates into financial advantages. Training an employee is expensive, as you all know. Losing them after the investment in training is not fiscally responsible, so it is very important to accommodate.
Thanks, Melissa, for telling us again why workplace accommodations are so nuanced, but also so important. Maybe we'll turn it over to Erin now. In practice, Erin, what are some examples of the most common workplace accommodation requests that you've received, and also the most outrageous? We'll have a bit of fun with it.
The most outrageous. That is a good question. So thanks for that. Starting with the most common workplace accommodation requests, I'd probably say the two biggest ones that I tend to see often are around requests for modified hours or flexible scheduling. And, this is often due to things like childcare, medical appointments, maybe somebody's, managing a chronic health condition, things like that, or even elder care. Well, there's lots of reasons for that. But it's probably one of the most frequent requests that I've seen in my practice. It's also one of the simplest ones to accommodate, especially post-pandemic, where flexibility is really becoming normalized in our workplaces and allowing for that. The second most frequent or common one is the request for remote work or maybe hybrid arrangements. Obviously, this has surged in the last few years. While some employers are really eager to get employees back on site and working out of the office, we are seeing a lot of employees framing remote work as sort of that functional accommodation, especially for mental health related needs. So those are the two that I get a lot of requests, or I see it a lot in my practice. In terms of the most outrageous, it never ceases to amaze me what kinds of things we get. But I'll start with saying that sometimes those outrageous requests don't always mean they're invalid. Sometimes it just really is a mismatch between what an employee's expectations are and what they think their employer's obligations are. And so sometimes those requests come to us, they're genuine, while we may think they're outrageous in the employee's eyes, they think they're asking something out of good faith. That said, there's a particular situation that stood out where I've had a request for someone to ask for a workplace our workspace renovation, including custom flooring, because they found the color of the flooring too emotionally triggering. So what I've learned in, my career of having to, receive these types of requests, and even these wildest ones, point to something underlying. And while we may have a knee-jerk reaction of some sort of judgment, it's worth still unpacking what that is. It doesn't mean that we have to accommodate everything. Of course, we go through that procedural aspect of that, but starting from a place of curiosity rather than judgment usually is a good place to start.
Yeah, excellent point about curiosity. Melissa, I'm curious, is there a procedure that employers should follow when working through an accommodation?
Well, there's no, as we've mentioned, all of us, I think,
Yeah.
there's no one size fits all approach. So what I would say is think about the AODA, which is something that almost every employer forgets, and take a look at what your individual accommodation plan is, which you should have, most of you should have, because it's often not either had or not used, but it certainly helps with the procedural duty to accommodate. So in terms of following a process or having a plan, as you know, the duty to accommodate includes two components. One is the procedural duty, and the other one is the substantive duty. And the procedural duty is as important as the outcome, and this is where employers often fail. So having a process is important, but it cannot be only a one type of process. So engage with the employee. That's going to be the first thing that I'm going to tell you when you call me. Engage with the employee. Ask those questions that Erin says. I loved what you said. Engage with the employee with curiosity and not skepticism, because that is truly how we need to start. It may be that down the road, the skepticism is warranted. But at the very beginning, you should engage with the employee. Use your individual accommodation plan that is required under the AODA as needed. There are lots of templates and samples online, but you always have to tailor it to your own circumstances. And so the procedural accommodation, when you think about it from a legal perspective, are the considerations and the steps that are taken to assess an accommodation need or an accommodation request. So this in and of itself is going to call for an individualized assessment of the person affected. So always start with an open dialogue with the employee, then request medical or whatever other necessary proof you may need to get, and then try to follow a standardized process, but not a blanket rule, right? Follow steps, document your process, engage back and forth. If you have a union, make sure that your union is involved, because the union can sometimes be helpful. And number two, they are part of the accommodation process when we have a union in the workplace. Hopefully that is enough to answer the question at a high level, because each situation is going to be very specific.
So we've talked a lot about obligations under the employer umbrella. I'm curious about obligations for employees. Are there any that employees have in the accommodation process, Erin?
Yeah. That is a good question. I know Melissa will speak to the legal side of this. It's an important question to actually think about while you're engaging in these, but it is very much a two-way street. Employers, carry that burden of the legal duty to accommodate up to that undue hardship that Melissa talked about, but employees also have a responsibility in that process. And I like to think of these in sort of four buckets. They have a duty to participate in good faith. They're expected to actively engage in that process. That does mean that they have to be honest, cooperative, and responsive to the requests that we send them for relevant information, or what we propose as solutions. It's not enough for an employee just to make a request and, stand back and wait for a response, an accommodation to come through without any activity. The other thing is that they need to provide information. So ensuring that that we're asking for the information that we're asking, But employees don't have to disclose their diagnosis. They only need to give us enough of that functional information to be able to, for us to be able to make an assessment of what those limit or the functional information so that we can then help assess that accommodation. So they need to explain what the limitations are that they're experiencing and how those impact their ability to perform the job. This does usually mean that there's a healthcare provider or medical professional in there that they're engaging to give us, the employer, that clear guidance. We can't really just accept those vague notes that, you're off work until further notice or you must work remotely type of thing. The other two pieces are they have to accept reasonable accommodation options. If the employer offers a solution that really is reasonable, even if it's not the employee's preferred option, they're generally expected to give that a try. Accommodation does not mean perfection. It does mean working together to find a solution for both the employee and the business. And then finally, they do have to maintain their job performance. I think Melissa touched on this on the essential duties. So once an accommodation is in place, employees are still expected to meet the core or essential expectations of their role within the limits of those restrictions that they have. Ultimately, the goal of accommodation is to level the playing field, not to eliminate performance standards. So that's my response. I'll turn it over to you, Melissa. Maybe you have some legal side to add to that.
When did you go to law school? No, you actually you actually covered absolutely everything. So I don't want to repeat myself with employee obligations, but maybe if I can
Yeah.
tell you a little bit more about the employer obligations, kind of in point form, as Erin put it. Actually engage in the accommodation process, and this goes for both, right? Because as Erin said, and as I was saying, it's not a one-way street, right? It's a two-way street, sometimes a three-way street when there's a union. So both the employer and the employee need to cooperate in the accommodation process and the union. And so actually engage in the accommodation process, that one goes for all. Ask questions. As an employer, it is very important that you ask questions so that you can determine what the needs of the employee are beyond what comes in paper, right? Because sometimes it needs additional explanation. Request medical or request other confirming documentation for whatever the type of accommodation that they are requesting. Do not turn a blind eye. I think this one is important, and this is certainly employer specific only. The employer cannot turn a blind eye to a situation where there's suspicions that we're dealing with mental health, family status, whatever it may be, right? The code imposes the duty to accommodate when there's a request for accommodation or when the employer knew or ought to have known that there was a situation or a protected ground involved. For the employer, if you can implement the accommodation, actually do it, right? It doesn't matter if it's a problematic employee. It doesn't matter, like sometimes I hear arguments, but this will open the floodgates. Well, that doesn't mean anything because only people who require accommodation based on their specific circumstances are going to necessitate to have this particular accommodation. And also, if you can only impose something or implement, not impose, if you can only implement something temporarily, then make sure that that is made clear to the employee. Otherwise, you will later likely lose that defense when you try to stop that accommodation. I've seen this happen very, very often where the employer didn't tell the employee that they could only implement a specific accommodation on a temporary basis. Then the restrictions move from temporary to permanent. And then we're at the Human Rights Tribunal trying to explain why we all of a sudden cannot continue to accommodate. So document your process. And if you're implementing an accommodation that is only possible because of specific circumstances or it's time limited or only goes up until certain project is available, you have to make that clear or you're going to lose a lot of the ability to do certain defenses.
Awesome.
Okay. Thank you so much. Appreciate that. So we're going to move along. I'd love to hear more about how to accommodate mental health disabilities while still managing performance expectations. I think this is one of the stickier ones that we tend to experience in the workplace. They can definitely be tricky. So, really interested to hear your thoughts on that question.
Melissa.
Melissa,
Okay.
pick on
Okay.
you first.
Absolutely. I think that what we need to remember is that mental health disabilities, as much as they sound and seem complicated, we need to, at some level, we need to distill them down to the basics. We still need to know restrictions and limitations. They need to be disability related restrictions and limitations, and they need to come from a healthcare professional most of the time. And so whether they're mental health or physical disabilities, that is still the same. We need to know the disability related restrictions and limitations, and we need to make sure that those are coming from a qualified healthcare professional that can provide us with those restrictions and limitations. Now, there's a lot to unpack in there, right? If your family doctor is giving you restrictions and limitations for a psychiatric disease or a psychiatric condition, then they may not be qualified to provide you those restrictions and limitations. If the family doctor is providing you with restrictions and limitations that are clearly based on self-reporting, Melissa tells me that she cannot attend the workplace, then you, once again, those are not necessarily disability related restrictions and limitations. So you need to really look at what's coming to you. Then you have to look at whether, let's say you're dealing with performance issues, you can't, once again, turn a blind eye, and you have to look at whether those performance issues could be related to those restrictions and limitations. Because I find myself in that situation often where my client will say, I have this situation, I have this person with this mental health condition, but their performance is brutal and I need to discipline them. And in fact, I'm thinking of firing them for it because it has nothing to do with their mental health condition. Then we start digging into what the restrictions and limitations are, and it turns out that some of the performance issues may be related to that, right? So you really need to distill down what the restrictions and limitations are and what the core of the performance issues are to determine whether they could be related to the disability. If they are related to a disability, then we cannot go down a disciplinary route, but we have to go down the accommodation path. But remember, while we're going down the accommodation route or the accommodation path, you have to remember that accommodation it's intended to enable the employee to perform the essential duties of their position. So if the performance issues are related to the restrictions and limitations, to the disability-related restrictions and limitations, and prevent the employee from performing the essential duties of their position, then that employee, if these are permanent, for instance, even with accommodation, then that employee may not be able to perform that position. And so we would have to see whether we're dealing with a situation where we have other positions that are available that are within the restrictions and limitations that we can offer this employee, right? So it's maintaining that systematic approach of bringing it down to, it's kind of like doing an investigation. When you hear an allegation and it's 10 pages long, but it turns out that there were only 2 issues in there, right? It's a bit of that without being disrespectful to mental health conditions, because there can be a lot added to a mental health situation that we need to bring it back to, okay, what are the restrictions and limitations? What are the essential duties? Can they perform the essential duties? And is there poor performance related to this? Then we can't discipline for that. Hopefully that helps a bit.
Yeah, thank you so much, Melissa. My next question is actually for the both of you. I'll ask Erin to respond first. What does undue hardship actually mean in practice?
This is always such a tricky one. So I am glad Melissa's going to cover the legal side of this, because it is, tricky. That's all I'm going to say. But in practice, it can be very murky. And from a practical standpoint, that undue hardship means that the accommodation being requested would place a significant strain on the organization both financially, operationally, and from a health and safety perspective. And that significant strain means different things for the different types of employers or size of employers. But the real thing is inconvenience is not seen as is not the same as hardship. Just because something is logistically tricky or pushes us out of our comfort zone doesn't mean that we've hit that undue hardship threshold. An example of that would be, shifting a schedule, rearranging duties, might require some creativity or temporary discomfort, for the employer or, maybe a counterpart of that employee, but it still often forms part of our duty to accommodate. Where I've seen this cross into the sort of undue hardship in the real life situations are, a small organization where you only have a handful of employees, but adjusting one person's schedule where that leaves no coverage for sort of critical operations, then that might fall under that. A request that requires you to hire a new person or some significant cost for some infrastructure or something like that within your facilities, that just isn't sustainable on a long term, or accommodations that would create a genuine and real safety risk for the employee themselves or others. I think it's also cumulative. So if you've tried multiple things, maybe Melissa can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but if you've tried a lot of things and things aren't working, maybe you can, that piece matters as well. In any event, my advice is always to document every single thing that you do. Try things in good faith and explore sort of a middle ground. I believe that, the tribunal is, they don't expect perfection, but they do expect you to explore things and in transparency. So it's really about, the undue hardship's really about less of slamming the door shut and more about clearly showing what you've done to try and accommodate that. I'll turn that back to you, Melissa.
Yeah. And I would say consult with legal before you're going to claim undue hardship because it's a very difficult defense to make out. So it's very difficult to prove. As Erin said, it depends on many factors. Erin did a great job at explaining it, but so I'll try not to repeat things. There is a very, very high onus. The employer actually bears the onus of demonstrating steps and assessments undertaken to substantiate that undue hardship. So Erin is correct. Document everything, and the cumulative effect. There's something to be said about that because you have to prove it is your onus if you're gonna, once the disability is established, and if then the onus turns over to the employee has the onus of establishing a disability that requires accommodation, and then the employer has the onus of establishing undue hardship. So you have to demonstrate the steps and the assessments that you undertook to substantiate undue hardship. Related to undue hardship, I would say it's training of management. Train your managers right. There is a significant risk of accommodating against company policies because managers on the ground often or sometimes do not understand what the company considers to be essential duties and what it will or will not accommodate. And when managers or supervisors make either undocumented or uninvestigated accommodations without the knowledge of HR or higher leadership, they could be impacting the company's ability to take action later, including making what otherwise would have been a valuable undue hardship argument. So management training is extremely important. To give you a couple of examples, there's a case, and I can put the name and citation in the chat, that has a neat explanation of undue hardship. And I'll tell you. Here we go. I just did it. So some of the facts that may be relevant to an appraisal of undue hardship are financial cost, as Erin mentioned, disruption of a collective agreement. Now, the courts and adjudicators and arbitrators and tribunal has said that some disruption to a collective agreement may be required, and even not ignoring, but overlooking seniority rules to accommodate an employee, the union has an obligation to do that too. So some of these are stronger. So financial hardship is definitely stronger. Disruption of a collective agreement depends. Problems of morale of other employees can come into play. However, I would warn you that also that's sort of a weak factor because the employer is expected to train their employees on the importance of human rights accommodation and discrimination and harassment. So depending on what those problems are, the size of the workplace, and the root cause for those problems, that is a very take it with a grain of salt factor, but it is mentioned there. Interchangeability of the workforce and facilities, right? As Erin was saying, an employer with maybe just 4 employees is very different from one with 25, 30, or 1,000 employees. So, and the size of the employer is important in the assessment. Safety, when safety is at issue, both the magnitude and the risk of the safety and the identity of those who bear it are relevant consideration. And then ultimately, what an adjudicator is going to do is they're going to balance all of these factors and they're going to come to a conclusion based on a balancing effect. So it's always on a case-by-case basis. We cannot give you a standard definition of what undue hardship would be. When it comes to cost, I would also warn you that cost must be substantial and not trivial to constitute undue hardship. There's always a cost associated with an accommodation. And 10 years ago, when I would speak about this, I had some stats that a basic accommodation would cost between $1,000 and $1,500. I don't have those numbers anymore, but we can expect that they're much higher than that. So there's interference with the operation of business and impact on other employees are also relevant factors. But once again, it has to be very significant. Shift splitting or moving to alternate positions may be an appropriate response to reduce those costs. And when it comes to health and safety, for instance, it's not sufficient for the workplace to generally be considered unsafe. It has to be a evidence required to prove the safety risks, not just a general understanding of a safety-sensitive workplace, because a failure to accommodate a worker's disability due to safety reasons in a safety-sensitive job environment may or may not be discriminatory depending on the circumstances. So if you're a medium or large-sized employer, the chances of establishing undue hardship in general and particularly based on cost are very slim. But ultimately, you're going to have evidence to prove undue hardship. It has to be real. It has to be objective. It cannot be speculative. So be prepared to open your financial books. Be prepared to talk about all of the reasons why you can't do what you're being asked to do. Financial statements maybe require scientific data and possibly sometimes expert opinions to prove undue hardship.
So call Melissa is what we're hearing from that. Yeah. So for those of us who work for smaller organizations, there's always the issue of perception of fairness across smaller teams. So I'm curious to hear from either one of you or both of you, how do we navigate that as people leaders?
So I'm going to let Erin respond to that one because she's going to have the more practical on the, at the workplace approach. Because what I'm going to tell you is that once again, employers are expected to train employees on human rights obligations. And so you're supposed to conduct your training. You may need to do training tailored to this. I can give you at least some practical advice here. You may need to do training tailored to the specific situation, right? Like we know that we are going to be dealing with an accommodation of X, Y, and Z, and it's something nuanced, it's something we never dealt with before. Let's do sensitive training with our employees and, let's bring them up to speed. Yeah, I'm going to leave it there and I'm going to let Erin respond.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah, that is sometimes a challenge that we tend to overlook. um, especially where there's small teams and everyone sees everything. And the changes that you make to one person's role are very visible to
Yeah.
everybody. And then you get the chatter in the office. Um, so it is a thing. The first thing I always try to remind people leaders is that equity is not the same as equality. Fairness doesn't mean treating everyone exactly the same. It does mean that you give people what they need to do their jobs to be successful. No accommodation is the same. We might have two people with the same type of disability. The accommodations are different. Um, but that sort of distinction isn't always intuitive to employees, especially if they're the ones that are feeling stretched or if they don't have all the context to know the situation. So really, how do we manage that? You have to be as transparent as possible without breaching confidentiality. We obviously can't disclose someone's personal situation, but you can say things like we're making adjustments to support our team members' well-being and their ability to work safely and effectively. And we appreciate your support and flexibility while we make that happen. Oftentimes, I find that reassures people and others that there is a process in place and that, it's not favoritism. We're actually managing something. The other piece of advice is be consistent in your approach. If you're all over the place, nobody will trust that. It does not mean, again, that the outcomes are going to be the same for everyone, but the process that you take at a high level should be the same. I think we talked a bit about the procedural aspect earlier. When people know that there's a clear and fair method for requesting and reviewing accommodations, they're more likely to trust those results, especially in smaller teams. And I also think it's really important to be proactive about team culture. And the more we normalize flexibility and compassion as part of what we do as a business, not just one-off sort of exceptions, the easier it is for people to see accommodations as part of a healthy and respectful workplace. It just goes back to what Melissa talked about. Like you have to train people to understand. We have AOTA training. We have all of that training. It's really important that they know that so that they're not questioning these things.
I also think there can be a positive perception where, a colleague sees somebody else being treated with equity, not equality, as you said so perfectly, Erin. And they know that if something comes up for them, life happens, that they'll be treated with the same fairness. Although fairness is hard to really define, they'll be treated with the same compassion, kindness, and due process. So, love that answer. Super helpful. Thank you both. We're moving toward more specific questions now. We're going to talk a little bit about medical note questions. Hopefully, this is beneficial for us all to hear as well. What do you do with a blanket note that states unable to work, will reassess in 4 weeks?
Because we get that so often, right?
Bane of our existence. Yeah.
I'll start, and I know Melissa's got some specifics on this too. From my perspective in HR, we have the right as employers to ask for details, and more so, we have a duty to understand those limitations and restrictions of employees so that we can appropriately assess accommodation requests. So employers, you're within your right to ask for that information, follow up for the appropriate information, and ask pointed questions. All that to say that we do need to stay away from asking questions about diagnosis or the actual types of treatments that people are in, based on, what an employee is requesting. That would be breaching confidentiality, but it does mean that we can include an FAF for completion, which is a functional abilities form. The other piece that would be super helpful, and I don't find a lot of employers have, some do, larger ones, is a copy of a PCDA, which is a physical and cognitive demands analysis, and that can be really helpful for if they provide that because it breaks down the job demands, so the physical, the cognitive, emotional, that sort of thing, and it gives that medical practitioner a better context to be able to offer more appropriate, meaningful restrictions and limitations so that we know how to use them when they come back to the employer to assess. It's better than those vague notes that we get, like, not able to handle stress or must be on light duties. All overall, we have to sort of shift that focus from, if someone can return to like, how can we actually support that return? How
Thank
are
you.
you?
Melissa, what do you think?
Yeah, those are all very good practical points. I'm going to give you a bit of the lawyer answer, and I'm going to say it depends, right? You may need to ask for, like, sometimes the note, because I think you said unable to work or reassess in 4 weeks. So is this the first note or is this the 10th note? Because if it's the first note, I may say to you, depending on the circumstances, right? I may say to you, you can't do anything with this. You kind of have to take it at face value. This person is totally disabled, unable to work for 4 weeks is totally disabled. Now, if we're on the 10th note of, unable to work for 4 weeks, or we're on the fifth or the fourth, depending on the circumstances, I may say, well, wait a second here. We need to send a letter back, or you may want to send a letter back to the doctor. You may want to ask for what are the actual restrictions and limitations that Melissa has that prevent her from coming to work for 4 weeks. For instance, is she able to, if applicable, is she able to work from home? Are the issues, if you know something about whatever it is that I have, you may be able to say, are the issues related to the work environment? Are the issues related to the hours of work? Your letter can include specific information of whatever you know to write back to this healthcare professional. You may need to, and it may be that the restrictions and limitations that come back are Melissa's totally disabled, and now you have to back off. But then you're going to follow up again. Okay, well, how long, is she engaged in a treatment plan? So at that point, it may be that I tell you, okay, let's write a letter asking for further and better medical. Can you explain the nature of the disability? You do not have to provide me the diagnosis. Can you tell me how long is Melissa expected to be totally disabled? Are we dealing with temporary, permanent? Are we, once again, what are the restrictions and limitations? Is there anything that we can do to ensure that Melissa can return to the workplace and, be a contributing member to the workplace? It might be that it's that the disability completely prevents them from working, but it may be that we end up in a situation where we can return them to work with modifications.
I appreciate the permission you've given us as people leaders to just ask more questions. I think there were so many years where I took doctor's notes at face value, and I think there are an awful lot of people in culture pros and employers out there who are afraid to ask anything. But as you've pointed out, you can ask follow-up questions without damaging the relationship with the employee or, stepping on any privacy toes. So I really appreciate those perspectives, both of you. And then just another quick question about doctor's notes. How should employers navigate discrepancies in the note? So the physician's given you the note, and we notice discrepancies perhaps in the requirements. How can we address them for a positive outcome?
Yeah,
Erin.
thanks. I think that's a good question.
Oh, Melissa. Okay,
Oh,
sure. Go
sorry, you
for it.
said Erin.
No,
Sorry.
no, that's okay.
Melissa, you go.
She's hot on the mic.
Well, I felt that it's very related, right?
Yeah.
Because it's going back to the ability to ask questions, ask them tactfully, respectfully, in a non-accusatory way, right? But it is key. The answer there, from my perspective, is we may need to follow up. We may need to do a letter. We need to explain in the letter that, you said this here, but then you said this here. Or sometimes I'll change the scenario a little bit. It's that the note from today is contradictory to the note from 3 weeks ago. and they might come from different healthcare professionals. So we start with a letter for, those of you who have worked with me, I call it the letter for farther and better medical. And so we start with that. We definitely tailor it to the situation. We include what Erin said about a position description form or a physical and cognitive demands analysis. We give the doctor as much as possible to give us the information that we need. And those of you who have worked with me also know that I don't ask the questions in one letter and expect the doctor to write a different letter. I kind of create my letter as a form where I leave the space so that the doctor can respond right under the question. Because if you do that, you're going to ask them 10 questions and they're going to respond to two. So, they might still do it when you leave the space there, but then now you have a much prettier thing to, not prettier, but a visual to focus on that you didn't respond half of my questions. So write back tactfully, respectfully, and ultimately we may get to a point where we need an IME. And if you have a union, you're going to need the union's buy-in. Of course, you're going to have to pay for the IME. You can't request an IME and expect the employee to pay for the IME, but I think those are my 2 cents, and I'll be quiet now and let Erin answer.
I don't actually have anything to add to that. I think that was great advice. Just for everyone here, an IME is an independent medical expert, just in case anyone didn't know what that was. But yeah, great response. I think we can move on, Michelle.
So I'm going to revisit mental health accommodations. They are happening with greater and greater frequency. Life is rough. Life has seasons of great difficulty, and it's very old school to think that how a person shows up is, different at work and different at home. We are who we are, and whatever we're going through does tend to show up in the workplace. What does an accommodation process look like when the employee's needs are related to a mental health situation or condition, like anxiety or depression, or even the desire to not return to the workplace after they've been working remotely for a while? Melissa, curious.
Okay. I would say, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but I would say it's the same, right?
Okay.
You need objective medical evidence, and the key here is objective, right? We need, don't be afraid to push back tactfully, respectfully, or request more when it is clear that the request or the medical is based on self-reporting. As we mentioned before, Melissa tells me that she cannot return to work. It would greatly damage her recovery. Well, how, right? Like, so we're going to ask those specific questions. We're gonna come up with specific questions to address that so we can get the disability related restrictions and limitations. And sometimes that will require us to educate ourselves on the disability. That can be a requirement of the procedural duty to accommodate. Not just your counsel, but you as the employer and your managers may need to educate yourselves in the specifics of the disability, not from just asking Dr. Google, but from engaging in a little bit more of a more formal educational approach.
That's great. Thank you. Erin, anything to add to that?
Nothing to add. No,
Okay,
good.
thank you. So just in the interest of time, we're going to move on to another question about accommodations with respect to mental health. Erin, maybe you could just walk us through some examples of typical accommodations in the workplace to support somebody going through a mental health situation.
Yeah. I'm going to preface this with like everyone is different. There are no two accommodations that are the same as we've talked about. But there's lots of options that we can do for the mental health aspect of it. And, getting creative and actually engaging in conversation is always the first step in anything that we do, but could be flexible scheduling. You could have a hybrid work arrangement while still managing, the performance and all of that piece. You could modify their workload if there's a heavy workload. I've seen that especially in social work positions where they need to reduce a caseload. You can extend a leave of absence if that's actually what is required, or maybe quiet or low stimulating type of workplace. Maybe they need a separate room. This all depends on the type of mental health condition or whatever they're going through at that moment. Um, Oftentimes you can't actually have a whole new workplace or work office for someone, so maybe noise canceling headphones would be helpful. Different communication styles. A lot of people I've seen, in my practices, are have a little bit of anxiety about actually having a conversation about tough things, and so maybe written communication is a lot easier and clearer. Regular check-ins, structured feedback, those are really important. In a any accommodation actually. Wellness breaks, maybe some time, additional breaks. Depends, it all depends too on what the medical comes back at. Flexibility for them to attend appointments. We try to aim for, the beginning and the end of your sort of work day. Sometimes it can be disruptive in the middle of the day, but being flexible to that if that's what's sort of needed. Maybe having phased return to work plans, those sorts of things.
Mhm.
It's getting creative in what
Getting
actually works.
creative, and then going back to some of the earlier comments you've both made about being curious, reserving all judgment, eliminating stigma by having really open conversation and listening more than we speak, et cetera, et cetera. It kind of goes back to just best practice for being a good leader, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
so.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay. So, when the employee is ready to come back to work, and we have the doctor's support, of course, and the documentation to support it, how should employers best prepare for an employee's return after leave?
That depends. That's my non-lawyer answer. It depends on how long they've been gone, which will dictate what you do to return them. I always like to think that when employees are away from work, especially if it is a longer period of time, that you maintain regular contact. They're still part of the team. They still need to know what's going on. It doesn't have to be a check-in always, like a follow-up to medical information, be like, hey, so and so just got promoted in the workplace today, or, some news or something that keeps them engaged so that they know what's happening. Um, Keeps them still feeling like they're actually part of the team. But once all the other stuff is gone and you're ready to return someone, if they've been gone for a long time, I always suggest like a bit of a reorientation
Mhm.
as a starting point. If it's only been a short period of time, that might not be necessary. But anyway, making sure that we're at least thoughtful in that process, flexible, and ensuring that whatever it is we do, a reorientation, get them back into their job is flexible and that supports their success.
That's
And get
great.
medical.
Yeah, go for it.
And the medical, yes.
And the medical.
Because sometimes you either need or want the medical because you want to know. I think employers will fall into, unless the employee already told you I'm clear to return to work without restrictions, then even that, get it confirmed by a doctor, right? Because then you bring them back, they get hurt, they file a WSIB claim, and then they file a human rights complaint. So get the medical clearing them to return to work, and whether it's a return to work with or without restrictions.
How can employers foster an environment overall that makes mental health accommodation requests easier? Erin, do you want to answer that one for us?
Sure. I think that it's really all about leading with empathy. We all, listen to the leadership stuff, and that's what's out there right now. But normalizing conversations about mental health, ensuring that there's confidentiality, and that it's always respected. That's actually really one of the most important points because I see it often that, it isn't always respected. Clear policies, visible support from leadership, and training for managers to help reduce that stigma. That goes back to what Melissa talked about earlier about making sure that we train our managers and all our employees on what accommodations are. When employees know that they're going to be treated with dignity and have that discretion and confidentiality, they're far more likely to ask for the help that they need, and that helps create that environment where they can do that.
That brings us to the end of our questions. unless either of you have anything else you'd like to add.
No, maybe there's questions from the audience.
Yeah, we've got 5 minutes left. If any, you guys can just pop some, you can either put yourself off mute and ask a question and or pop it in the chat if there are any questions. Maybe we answered them all through our discussion. I don't see any
Nice to
questions.
see some familiar names. I can't say faces, but some familiar names.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, we'll just leave the chat open for 2 or 3 more minutes in case somebody has a question for the panel. But otherwise,
Yeah, we're going to send out the recording, so expect I'll send out an email with that, and then contact information. And yeah, thank you. Thanks for joining us, guys. Yeah, I don't see any other questions. Have a great day.
I don't see
Well,
any.
thank you, everyone. I hope you had some takeaways from this.
Okay, thanks everybody for attending, and thanks to our panel. Have a great day.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you,
Okay,
Erin.
bye-bye.